That daily work is what remains after the myth recedes. It is also what any surviving version of WeWork depends on. A smaller WeWork can still be useful if the daily work is done well. It does not need to claim cosmic importance. It needs to provide good space at a workable price with obligations it can carry. That sentence is not glamorous. It is healthier than the old one. There is peace in a company learning to describe itself accurately. Accuracy lowers the temperature. It helps employees know what they are building. It helps customers know what they are buying. It helps investors know what they own. It helps leaders make decisions without defending a myth. WeWork's original tragedy was not that it wanted work to feel better. That was a worthy ambition. Its tragedy was that it needed that worthy ambition to become a financial story too large for the business beneath it. When a good idea is overcapitalized, the capital can deform it. The company stops asking what size the idea wants to be. It asks what size the valuation requires. This is a subtle but important difference. Some ideas want to be modest. Some want to be regional. Some want to grow slowly. Some need careful local adaptation. Some become worse when forced to scale too quickly. WeWork's idea may have needed discipline more than acceleration. It received acceleration. The acceleration felt like success until it became exposure. That pattern appears across business history. A company finds something real. Capital floods in. Growth becomes proof. The original insight becomes surrounded by secondary ambitions. The company expands into adjacent dreams. Management becomes less focused. The valuation rises. The organization changes to serve the valuation. Then the market asks whether the original insight can support everything built on top of it. Often it cannot. The insight survives. The structure fails. In WeWork, the insight was that work needed more flexible, human spaces. The failing structure was the global, founder-driven, heavily leased, heavily funded mythology around that insight. Seen this way, the story becomes less like a joke and more like a warning about proportion. Proportion is one of the quiet virtues in business. The size of the claim should match the strength of the evidence. The size of the company should match the durability of demand. The size of the valuation should match the quality of earnings. The size of founder power should match the strength of oversight. The size of the mission should match the company's actual responsibilities. WeWork lost proportion. The company was large where it needed to be careful. It was poetic where it needed to be precise. It was certain where it needed to be cautious. It was expansive where it needed to be disciplined. This loss of proportion made the collapse feel inevitable in retrospect. But inevitability is often visible only after the fact. In the moment, people saw growth. They saw famous investors. They saw crowded offices. They saw a founder who could fill a room. They saw a world changing around work. They saw enough truth to make the excess believable. That is the most dangerous kind of story. Not a story with no truth, a story with enough truth to protect its exaggerations. The final archive note, then, is not simply beware of charismatic founders. It is not simply beware of venture capital. It is not simply beware of co-working. It is quieter than that. Beware when a true thing is asked to carry an untrue amount of weight. At WeWork, the true thing was human. People wanted better rooms. People wanted flexibility. People wanted connection. People wanted work to feel less sterile and less lonely. The untrue weight was financial and spiritual. The company asked that human need to justify a valuation, a culture, a governance structure, and an expansion plan that the business could not carry. When the weight became too much, the true thing did not disappear. It simply stepped out from under the myth. The desk remained. The room remained. The worker remained. The need remained. The myth fell. This is why the story can end quietly. Not with a crash, not with a speech, not with a founder walking barefoot through a crowded office, but with a person sitting down at a desk in a room that no longer claims to save the world. They open a laptop, the screen lights their face. Outside, morning moves across the city. The building is no longer a symbol of a $47 billion future. It is a building. The table is no longer proof of a global movement. It is a table. The coffee is no longer part of a mythology. It is coffee. The work begins, quietly, without needing to be larger than itself. That may be the gentlest correction the story offers. Work does not need to be a religion. A company does not need to become a movement to be useful. A room does not need to elevate consciousness to shelter concentration. A desk does not need to be a revolution. It only needs to hold the weight placed on it. WeWork placed too much weight on the desk. The desk could not hold it. So the file closes again. The papers are aligned. The S1 returns to the folder. The lease agreements rest behind it. The valuation is written in one column, the bankruptcy in another. Between them sits the word community, no longer glowing, no longer mocked, simply waiting to be used with more care. The archive light dims. The office outside the file is still. The chairs are empty. The plants are quiet. The glass reflects nothing but the room. And the old lesson remains, plain enough to read without a pitch deck. Belonging is valuable, but it is not a balance sheet. And perhaps that is where the calmest lesson waits. Not in the spectacle, not in the founder's exit, not in the jokes people made afterward. The lesson waits in the difference between a need and a company. A need can be timeless. A company is temporary. A need can belong to millions of people. A company belongs to its contracts, its owners, its managers, its workers, and its creditors. A need can be emotionally true even when the business built around it is financially wrong. People needed connection at work before WeWork. They needed it during WeWork. They will need it after WeWork. The company did not invent the loneliness, it named it. For a time, naming it was enough to gather people, money, attention, and hope. But naming a problem is not the same as solving it. Solving it requires a structure that can endure. It requires costs that match revenue. It requires leaders who can tell the difference between inspiration and evidence. It requires investors who can admire a vision without surrendering arithmetic. It requires a culture where the person asking the boring question is not treated as an enemy of the dream. The boring question may save the dream. What does this cost? How long can this last? Who carries the risk? What happens if growth slows? What happens if the market changes? What happens if the founder is wrong? These questions sound small only when the room is full of belief. Later they sound like mercy. If they had been asked more firmly earlier, WeWork might still have grown. It might have grown differently. It might have become smaller, steadier, less famous, and more durable. It might have disappointed fewer people. It might have kept the best part of its promise without making the promise impossible to keep. There is no way to know. Business history does not allow the file to be rewritten. It only allows the file to be read. So we read it slowly. We read the leases. We read the mission statements. We read the funding rounds. We read the S1. We read the layoffs. We read the bankruptcy filing. And underneath all of it, we read the old human desire for a place to belong while doing difficult work. That desire is still there. It is quieter now. It does not need a stage. It does not need a founder walking through the room like weather. It does not need a $47 billion number. It needs a chair. It needs light. It needs a surface for a laptop. It needs enough silence to think. It needs enough company to feel less alone. That is a modest promise. A modest promise can still be beautiful. It is also easier to keep. The file closes on that modesty. The office does not glow anymore. It rests. The doors are locked for the night. The city hums beyond the windows. Tomorrow, work will begin again somewhere. Not as a revolution, not as a movement, not as a valuation, only as work. And that is enough. Still, the archive keeps one final layer of the story. It is the layer that belongs to the people who were never in the boardroom. The people who did not meet Masayoshi Son. The people who did not write the S1. The people who did not decide whether Adam Neumann should remain chief executive. They were the workers in the buildings. They were the members paying month to month. They were the small companies trying to look steady. They were the cleaners, reception staff, community teams, contractors, designers, and operations people who made the office function before anyone arrived with a camera. Large business stories often rise toward famous names. They move toward founders, investors, bankers, and executives. That is natural. Power leaves records. Power signs documents. Power appears on stages. But collapse moves downward. It reaches people whose names are not in the filings. It reaches the employee who has to tell a member that a service is changing. It reaches the team that has to pack up a location. It reaches the worker who believed the options might one day pay for a home. It reaches the landlord's staff trying to understand whether a floor will be empty. It reaches the small founder who chose a WeWork address because it made the company feel more permanent than it was. These consequences are quieter than valuation charts. They are also more durable. A valuation can fall in an afternoon. A person may remember the feeling for years. The WeWork file therefore asks for two kinds of attention. One attention belongs to finance. It studies leases, losses, governance, funding rounds, and bankruptcy. The other belongs to ordinary life. It studies how belief enters a workplace, how people arrange hope around a company, how a brand becomes part of identity, how a room can make a person feel safer than the balance sheet really is. Both forms of attention are necessary. Finance explains how the structure failed. Ordinary life explains why people cared when it did. Without the first, the story becomes vague. Without the second, it becomes cold. WeWork was never only numbers. It was also a feeling. The feeling was not enough to save it, but it was enough to make the fall matter. Years from now, the company may be remembered in simplified form. A strange founder, a failed IPO, a $47 billion valuation, a bankruptcy. Those details are true. But the fuller lesson is softer and more useful. It is that modern business often sells emotional repair. Not only products, not only services, repair. It sells relief from loneliness, relief from inconvenience, relief from uncertainty, relief from feeling small. WeWork sold relief from the isolation of work. That is why it resonated. And because the wound was real, the remedy could be overvalued. People wanted the remedy to work. Investors wanted it. Employees wanted it. Members wanted it. Cities wanted lively offices. Landlords wanted filled floors. Journalists wanted a symbol. The desire around the company became part of the company. Then desire met obligation. The obligation was patient. It waited in the leases. It waited in the rent schedules. It waited in the maturities. It waited in the cash burn. It waited behind the plants and the glass and the gentle hum of people working. That is why the file is worth keeping. Not because it teaches that ambition is bad. Ambition built the rooms. Not because it teaches that community is false. Community did exist in places. Not because it teaches that flexible work is foolish. Flexible work became more important, not less. The file teaches that the structure around a true idea must be worthy of the idea. If the structure is weak, the true idea is placed in danger. If the financing is excessive, the true idea is forced to perform beyond its nature. If the language is too grand, the true idea becomes harder to protect. In the end, the best part of WeWork may have needed less myth, less spectacle, less pressure to become everything, more patience, more restraint, more respect for the plain business underneath. There is no shame in a plain business. A plain business can endure. It can pay people. It can serve customers. It can improve slowly. It can survive a bad year. It can tell the truth about itself and still be valuable. WeWork wanted to be more than plain. For a while, the world rewarded that wanting. Then the world asked for proof. The proof did not arrive in time. So now, when the file is placed back into the archive, the final label can be simple. Not fraud, not fantasy, not genius, not madness. A true need, a beautiful package, a costly structure, a valuation too heavy for the room. That is enough to remember. And if the listener carries only one image from the file, let it be the simplest one. Not the founder, not the investor, not the valuation. Only the empty desk. The desk is quiet because it has no opinion about the story built around it. It does not know whether it belongs to a startup, a freelancer, a global corporation, or a bankrupt estate. It does not know whether the room is called a community, a platform, a workplace solution, or simply an office. It only waits for weight, a laptop, a notebook, a cup of coffee, 2 hands, one ordinary day of work. That modesty is almost healing after the scale of the collapse. It reminds us that business stories often become dangerous when they lose contact with the small thing they actually do. A bank holds trust, a laboratory test must be accurate, an energy trader must respect arithmetic, an office company must make space useful at a price it can sustain. The principle is not complicated, But ambition complicates it, capital complicates it, charisma complicates it, markets complicate it, language complicates it. By the time the story reaches the public, the small thing can be buried under layers of interpretation. WeWork's small thing was a place to work without signing a traditional lease. That was useful. That was understandable. That could be priced, tested, improved, and repeated carefully. But the company did not remain with the small thing. It built a cathedral of language around it. The cathedral was beautiful for a while. People walked inside and felt elevated. Investors looked up and saw height. Employees heard the echo and thought it was permanence. Then the foundation was examined. The foundation was made of leases, losses, and belief. Belief can support a story. It cannot support a building forever. So the final quiet is not empty. It is corrective. It brings the story back down to human scale. A room, a desk, a worker, a company that needed to tell the truth about what it was. There will be other companies like it. They will use different words. They will have different founders. They will appear in different decades, under different market conditions, with different investors and different symbols. Some will be real and disciplined. Some will be real and overvalued. Some will be imaginary from the beginning. The task is not to reject every large vision. The task is to ask what the vision is resting on. If it rests on durable economics, it may endure. If it rests on denial, it will eventually ask someone else to pay. WeWork asked many people to pay. Some paid with money, some paid with jobs, some paid with trust, some paid with time. The file keeps those payments together. It does not shout over them, it lets them settle. Then it closes. The lights lower, the office returns to silence, and the desk, relieved of the myth, becomes only what it always was, a place to begin work. That beginning is not dramatic, it does not need to be. Most work begins quietly. Most companies are built through repetition rather than revelation. An email answered. A call returned. A room cleaned. A bill paid. A customer served. A promise kept at the scale it was made. That is the discipline WeWork lost in the noise. And that is the discipline the file leaves behind. Keep the promise close to the work. Keep the story close to the numbers. Keep the room close to the rent. Keep the mission close to what can actually be done. When those distances grow too wide, collapse begins moving before anyone can hear it. By the time the sound reaches the market, the structure may already be tired, so the archive grows quiet. The papers stop moving. The last light fades from the glass. And somewhere beyond the file, in a plain room without mythology, someone sits down, opens a laptop, and begins. The work is quiet, but it is real. And real work, unlike myth, can survive the morning. It continues without applause. The document arrived quietly. It did not have the sound of a door closing. It did not have the drama of a boardroom explosion. It was only a filing, a long document sent into the public machinery of American finance. But once it appeared, the room changed. The company that had called itself a movement was suddenly being read like a lease. The company that had spoken about consciousness was suddenly being measured in losses. The company that had told investors it was changing the world was suddenly being asked a simpler question. How much money does it make? And how much money does it owe? In August 2019, the We company filed its S-1 registration statement. It was preparing to sell shares to the public. For years, private investors had treated WeWork as one of the great companies of the future. It had been valued at $47 billion. That number was large enough to change the way people looked at ordinary rooms. A desk became a product, a building became a platform, a hallway became evidence of a new economy, and Adam Neumann, the co-founder at the center of it, became the kind of founder investors wanted to believe still existed, tall, magnetic, unusually certain. He spoke about work as if he had discovered something hidden inside it. He spoke about loneliness, he spoke about community, he spoke about changing the way people lived, he spoke about elevating the world's consciousness. The phrase sounded too large for an office company. That detail would matter later. The S-1 did not destroy WeWork because it revealed that the company had no business. The business was real. The buildings were real. The members were real. The rent checks were real. The problem was more delicate than that. The S1 destroyed the old WeWork story because it forced the public to see the business without the lighting. It showed a company that leased space for years and rented it out for months. It showed enormous future obligations. It showed heavy losses. It showed a founder whose personal financial life had become tangled with the company he controlled. It showed governance arrangements that gave him extraordinary power. It showed a company trying to enter the public markets while still speaking the language of a private dream. The public story was clean. The private reality was not. Within weeks, the planned public offering began to collapse. The valuation fell. Investors hesitated. Questions multiplied. Adam Neumann stepped down as chief executive. The company that had once been worth $47 billion was suddenly fighting for survival. Thousands of employees would lose their jobs. SoftBank would take control. The dream would be rewritten by lawyers, lenders, landlords, and restructuring advisors. And in 2023, years after the first public unraveling, WeWork filed for bankruptcy. The office spaces did not vanish all at once. That is not how buildings fail. Buildings remain. The glass walls remain. The desks remain. The phone booths remain. Someone still turns on the lights in the morning. But something else had gone missing. The belief had changed shape. The office smelled like kombucha and ambition. That is not a metaphor. Kombucha was served at WeWork locations around the world. It sat beside cold brew coffee and polished communal tables. It became one of those small details people remembered because it seemed to contain the whole story. The drink was not important by itself, but it belonged to a certain atmosphere. An office that did not want to feel like an office. A landlord that did not want to be called a landlord. A real estate company that wanted to be valued like software. The walls were glass. The furniture was chosen carefully. The plants were real. The Wi-Fi was fast. The lighting softened the hard edges of work. In some locations, a person could arrive with a laptop and feel, for a moment, that the future had already been decorated. There was energy in the rooms. Some of it was genuine. People starting companies do need places to work. Freelancers do need desks. Small teams do need meeting rooms. Remote workers do need somewhere outside their apartments. Young companies do not always want 10-year leases. They do not always know how many employees they will have next year. They do not always want to negotiate with commercial landlords. WeWork solved a real problem. That is part of why the story is more interesting than simple failure. The promise was not imaginary. The execution was not empty. The need was there. But the problem was already inside the machine. WeWork had to sign long leases to create short-term flexibility for its members. It had to take on fixed obligations so customers could avoid them. It had to spend heavily before revenue arrived. It had to renovate spaces before members paid. It had to keep filling rooms. It had to keep expanding. It had to keep persuading investors that growth itself was proof. The model could work in a disciplined form. It could work building by building. It could work if expansion was controlled. It could work if rent commitments were matched carefully against demand. But WeWork did not want to be a modest office business. It wanted to become a category. It wanted to become a verb. It wanted to become infrastructure for a new way of working. That ambition required capital. Capital required a story. And the story required Adam Neumann. Adam Neumann was born in 1979 in Beersheba, Israel. His parents divorced when he was young. He spent parts of his childhood moving from place to place. He was raised partly on a kibbutz, where community is not a marketing word but a daily structure. Meals are shared, work is shared, life is organized around collective rhythms. The individual still exists, but the group is always near. For a child who moved often, that idea could carry unusual force. A place where people belong, a place where work and life are not fully separated, a place where the room itself helps create identity. Neumann later carried that idea into the language of WeWork. He did not describe the company as a collection of desks. He described it as a community. He used the word often. He used it with employees. He used it with investors. He used it on stages and in interviews. He used it until the word seemed to acquire weight. This was one of his gifts. He could make abstract language feel physical. He could stand in a room and make the people inside it feel the room was part of a much larger design. He was 6 feet 5 inches tall. He had presence before he had evidence. People noticed him before he spoke. Many remembered him after he left. That kind of presence is not a business model, but it can become part of one. In venture capital, especially during the years when software companies were remaking whole industries, founder charisma had become a kind of asset. Investors were not only buying revenue, they were buying ambition. They were buying the possibility that a founder might bend a market before the market understood what was happening. The technology world had trained them to look for unlikely people with enormous conviction. Sometimes those people built companies that changed everything. Sometimes they built companies that changed the language around an ordinary business. The difference was not always visible at the beginning. Neumann arrived in New York after serving in the Israeli Navy. He studied at Baruch College. He tried different businesses. Some were unremarkable, some did not work, but he had energy, he had appetite, he had the ability to keep moving. In 2010, he co-founded WeWork with Miguel McKelvey. McKelvey brought design sensibility and operational calm. He had grown up in Oregon in a collective environment of his own. He understood buildings. He understood how space could shape feeling. Together, Neumann and McKelvey built a company around a simple observation. New York had office space. A new class of workers needed flexible access to that space. The old office system was built for companies that knew who they were. It was built for firms with lawyers, accountants, and multi-year plans. It was built for businesses that could sign long leases and hire brokers and commit to square footage far into the future. But the new economy was producing smaller teams, freelancers, startups, consultants, designers, coders, people with laptops and uncertain futures. They did not want to work alone forever. They did not want to sit in coffee shops forever. They wanted professionalism without permanence. They wanted community without bureaucracy. They wanted a place that felt serious but not old. WeWork offered that place. At first, the idea made practical sense. The company would lease large offices. It would divide them into smaller spaces. It would add design, furniture, internet, coffee, meeting rooms, events, and a sense of belonging. Then it would sell memberships. One person could rent a desk. A small startup could rent a private office. A growing company could add people without changing buildings. WeWork would handle the physical burden. The members would receive flexibility. The margin would come from the difference between long-term wholesale rent and short-term retail membership revenue. That was the machine. It was not mysterious. It was not magic. It was real estate arbitrage wrapped in experience. The wrapping mattered. In ordinary real estate, a landlord thinks in square feet. In WeWork's world, square feet became moments. A hallway could be designed to create accidental meetings. A kitchen could become a social engine. A glass wall could make a small company feel more visible to itself. An event could turn strangers into members of something. The product was not only space. The product was the feeling of not being alone while building something uncertain. That feeling had value. It still has value. But feelings do not cancel lease obligations. That was the quiet fact under the music. The early WeWork spaces carried the style of their time. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs, long tables, casual seating, phone booths, chalkboard walls, beer taps, conference rooms named with a certain informal cleverness. The spaces did not look like traditional offices. They looked like the office version of a lifestyle. This mattered to members. A two-person startup could invite a client into a WeWork conference room and look larger than it was. A freelancer could arrive in the morning and feel part of a larger rhythm. An employee could tell friends they worked in a place that sounded modern. The design helped convert rent into identity. Investors noticed. They saw occupancy, they saw growth, they saw young companies choosing WeWork, they saw large companies beginning to experiment with flexible office arrangements. They saw urban workers spending more of life in places that blended work and social identity. They saw a brand. And in the years after the financial crisis, investors were looking for brands that could grow quickly. Low interest rates made money cheaper. Venture funds had more capital to deploy. The success of technology platforms had changed expectations. If software could remake taxis, hotels, payments, shopping, media, and food delivery, perhaps software like branding could remake offices. WeWork was not exactly software, but it borrowed the language of software. It spoke about scale. It spoke about network effects. It spoke about data. It spoke about platform economics. It spoke about enterprise customers. It spoke about a global addressable market. The language helped. The valuation rose. The company expanded from New York into other cities. It opened in San Francisco, Los Angeles, London, Tel Aviv, and beyond. It entered markets where the brand could travel faster than local profitability. Each new location became both a business decision and a signal. The map itself became part of the pitch. Investors could look at dots around the world and see inevitability. Employees could look at the same map and feel they were inside a movement. Members could walk into a WeWork in one city and recognize the feeling from another. That consistency created confidence. But one number did not fit. The faster WeWork grew, the more money it needed. Growth was not free. Every new building required lease commitments. Every build-out required spending. Every new market required staff, sales, design, construction, legal work, and local knowledge. If a software company grows quickly, each new customer may cost relatively little to serve once the product exists. If an office company grows quickly, each new building is a physical project. Walls must be built, furniture must be bought, floors must be maintained, landlords must be paid. The software comparison made the company feel lighter than it was. The lease obligations made it heavy. This was not a small distinction. It was the center of the story. The company wanted to be valued like a technology platform, but much of its risk looked like commercial real estate. Public investors would eventually see that more clearly than private investors had. Before that moment arrived, the company kept rising. Adam Neumann became more than a founder. He became the human expression of the pitch. He could describe WeWork in ways that felt almost spiritual. He could move from office desks to human purpose without seeming embarrassed by the distance. He could make employees feel that ordinary tasks belong to a larger mission. Signing leases, selling memberships, managing buildings, ordering furniture, planning events. All of it could be folded into the language of community. That language can be powerful inside a company. It gives people stamina. It turns work into identity. It makes late nights feel meaningful. It makes sacrifice easier to justify. But it can also blur the line between belief and measurement. When a company says it is changing the world, ordinary questions can begin to feel small. Questions about cost, questions about governance, questions about whether the model works building by building, questions about what happens in a downturn, questions about what happens if members leave faster than landlords can be paid. Someone had noticed, but noticing was not enough. Inside WeWork and around it, many people understood parts of the risk. Real estate people understood leases. Finance people understood cash burn. Lawyers understood governance. Employees understood the intensity of the culture. Some investors understood that the company was not a pure technology business. But the story kept moving. Momentum is its own kind of argument. When a valuation rises, it can make skepticism feel outdated. When famous investors write checks, smaller investors assume due diligence has been done. When growth numbers are large, losses can be framed as investments. When a founder is charismatic, doubts can be interpreted as lack of vision. And when the office is full of young people working beneath soft lights, drinking cold brew, attending member events, and speaking the language of the future, the old numbers can look temporarily negotiable. They were not negotiable. They were only waiting. The rise of WeWork happened during a particular moment in American business culture. It is difficult to understand the company without understanding the years around it. The financial crisis had shaken trust in old institutions. Banks looked damaged. Traditional careers looked less secure. The office itself was changing. People carried powerful computers in backpacks. Startups could begin with a small team and a rented table. Work was becoming more mobile. Cities were filling with people who did not fit neatly into the old categories. They were not always employees. They were not always entrepreneurs. They were not always freelancers. Many were moving between those identities. WeWork arrived with a physical answer to that uncertainty. It gave uncertain workers a place that looked certain. It gave young companies a front door. It gave investors a story about the future of work. It gave landlords a tenant willing to take large blocks of space. It gave journalists a visible symbol of a changing economy. And it gave Adam Neumann a stage. The stage mattered. In a different era, WeWork might have been judged as a clever office subleasing company. It might have grown more slowly. It might have built a disciplined portfolio. It might have lived somewhere between real estate and hospitality. It might have become a respected business with a smaller valuation. But the decade rewarded scale. Scale was the word that turned expenses into strategy. Scale meant opening quickly. Scale meant spending before profits arrived. Scale meant persuading investors that the largest player would eventually control the market. Scale meant that a company could lose money now if the losses purchased dominance later. That logic worked in some software markets. If a platform becomes the place where everyone already is, the platform becomes more valuable to every new user. Social networks have that quality. Marketplaces can have that quality. Payment systems can have that quality. Certain software tools can have that quality. But offices are different. A desk in Manhattan does not become much more useful because someone else has rented a desk in London. A meeting room in Boston does not automatically improve because WeWork has opened a space in Shanghai. There are brand advantages. There are customer relationships. There are procurement benefits for large companies. There is convenience in a global network. But a building remains local. Rent is local. Demand is local. Construction is local. Regulation is local. The economics of each location must eventually stand on its own. WeWork tried to turn local rooms into a global story. For a while it succeeded. The company became one of the most recognizable private startups in the world. Its name appeared in cities across continents. Its offices became background scenery for the age of the startup. To walk through a WeWork in those years was to move through a carefully staged version of modern ambition. There were founders taking calls in glass rooms, designers bending over laptops, sales teams gathered around whiteboards, people wearing headphones at communal tables, people carrying coffee, people waiting for conference rooms, people trying to appear calm while building uncertain lives. The atmosphere was not fake. The ambition in those rooms was real. The problem was what WeWork did with that reality. It treated the feeling as if it could carry almost any valuation. Private capital helped. Benchmark invested early. JP Morgan supported the company. Other investors arrived. Then SoftBank became central. SoftBank's Vision Fund was one of the defining financial instruments of the era. It was enormous. It was built to write checks that changed competitive landscapes. Its leader, Masayoshi Son, believed in founders who could capture huge markets. He had made one of the most famous venture investments in history with Alibaba. He understood what it looked like when an early bet became extraordinary. That experience mattered. It made large visions easier to believe. It made unusual founders easier to fund. It made speed feel like wisdom. When Son met Neumann, the story became almost mythic. Accounts of the meeting describe a short conversation that helped set the stage for billions of dollars in support. The exact details have been retold in different ways. But the larger fact is clear. SoftBank saw in WeWork a company that could become far larger than ordinary office leasing. It invested heavily. The investment helped push WeWork's valuation to $47 billion in early 2019. That number changed everything. A valuation is not only a price, it is a signal. It tells employees what their options might be worth. It tells competitors what kind of opponent they face. It tells landlords that the company has backing. It tells journalists that the company matters. It tells other investors that someone powerful believes. And it tells the founder that his story has been priced by the market, even when the market is private and narrow. The $47 billion number did not mean public investors had agreed. It meant private investors had funded the company at that level. That distinction would become important. Private markets can be patient. They can be concentrated. They can be shaped by a few large checks. They can tolerate unusual governance. They can accept losses if the narrative is strong enough. Public markets are different. They are not always wiser. They can be emotional, crowded, and short-sighted, but they require disclosure. They require comparison. They require a company to stand in daylight among other companies. The S1 would force that transition. Before it arrived, WeWork continued to expand its ambitions. The company changed its name to the We Company. The change was revealing. WeWork was an office brand. The We Company sounded like a civilization project. It suggested that work was only one piece of a larger design. There was WeLive, an attempt to bring the WeWork sensibility into residential living. There was WeGrow, an education venture associated with Rebecca Neumann. There were ideas about wellness, community, and life itself. The word "we" became elastic. It could attach to almost anything. That elasticity was part of the danger. A focused company can be measured against a focused promise. An unfocused movement can always explain failure as incomplete transformation. If office leasing struggled, perhaps the company was really about community. If community sounded vague, perhaps it was really about technology. If technology did not explain the leases, perhaps it was really about consciousness. The language kept moving. The obligations did not. The leases remained fixed. This is where the machinery of WeWork deserves slow attention. Imagine a building owner with empty floors. The owner wants a tenant. A large tenant is valuable because it fills space and signs a long agreement. WeWork arrives and leases a large portion of the building. It may commit for 10 years or more. The landlord receives confidence. WeWork receives control of space. Then WeWork spends money to transform that space. Walls are moved, meeting rooms are built, kitchens are installed, furniture is purchased, internet systems are set up, staff are hired, the location opens, members begin paying monthly fees. If the space fills quickly and stays full, the model can look attractive. WeWork pays the landlord one amount. Members collectively pay WeWork a larger amount. The difference helps cover operating costs and eventually profit. But if demand weakens, the member revenue can fall quickly. The lease payment does not fall with it. Members can leave. The landlord still expects rent. That mismatch is the center of the risk. It is a maturity mismatch. Long-term obligations, short-term revenue. The longer the lease and the shorter the membership commitment, the more confidence the company needs in continued demand. During good times, the mismatch can be hidden by growth. New locations produce new revenue. Investors focus on expansion. Losses can be described as the cost of building a network. But during stress, the mismatch becomes visible. A downturn does not need to destroy every location. It only needs to reduce occupancy enough to expose the fixed costs. The company must still pay rent. It must still maintain spaces. It must still service obligations. It must still persuade members, landlords, lenders, and investors that the future is stable. Confidence becomes part of the balance sheet. That is dangerous, because confidence is not a permanent asset. It can leave quickly. WeWork's private investors understood some of this. They were not all naive. Many could read leases. Many could see losses. Many knew that the company was risky. But risk can look acceptable if the possible reward is large enough. And WeWork's possible reward was described in enormous terms. The company was not only renting desks, it was, according to its story, reorganizing work. It was building a global network. It was capturing data about how people use space. It was serving enterprises. It was becoming the operating system for offices. That phrase or versions of it mattered because it transformed a hard asset business into something that sounded like software. But there is a difference between using software and being software. WeWork used software. It used apps, access systems, member platforms, analytics, and digital tools. Many real estate companies use software. That does not make rent disappear. The number looked impressive, but the number was carrying more weight than it could hold. The $47 billion valuation suggested that WeWork belonged among the defining technology companies of its generation. Its financial statements suggested something more grounded. The company had revenue. It also had enormous losses. In the first half of 2019, the S1 showed more than $1.5 billion in revenue and a net loss of roughly $619 million. Other measures showed even larger adjusted losses depending on the period and definition. The point was not only that the company lost money. Many growth companies lose money before they mature. The point was the nature of the spending. WeWork was not only investing in code that could later serve millions at low marginal cost, it was investing in physical locations with continuing obligations. Every city added complexity. Every lease added weight. Every beautiful office had to be filled. The machine required constant feeding. For a while, capital fed it. SoftBank's money gave WeWork room to expand faster than a normal office company could have expanded. It also gave the company permission to avoid certain disciplines. When money is scarce, decisions must be ranked. When money is abundant, the ranking can soften. Projects multiply. Side ventures appear. Executives travel. Culture becomes more elaborate. The company begins to mistake access to capital for proof of durability. WeWork was not alone in this. It belonged to a broader era. Many startups were encouraged to grow first and explain profits later. The public markets had accepted losses from companies that promised large futures. But WeWork stretched the logic farther than most. It was asking investors to believe that real estate could behave like a network technology platform. It was asking employees to believe that stock options tied to a private valuation would one day become life-changing. It was asking landlords to believe that WeWork would remain strong enough to honor long leases. It was asking members to believe that the community would remain intact. It was asking the public to believe that the company was not merely an office provider. Each audience received a version of the story. Each version made sense from a distance. The S-1 shortened the distance. The filing landed in August 2019. It was not written like a confession. S-1 documents are not designed for poetry. They are built from risk factors, financial statements, ownership tables, related party disclosures, descriptions of operations, and legal language. They are long because public markets require companies to say things that private rooms can sometimes leave unsaid. For WeWork, that requirement was severe. The S-1 asked the company to translate its dream into disclosures. The translation was not flattering. The document showed rapid revenue growth. It also showed large losses. It showed a company with vast lease commitments. It showed a founder with unusual control. It showed transactions between the company and entities connected to Adam Neumann. It showed that the company had paid an entity linked to him for rights connected to the word "we" after the corporate name change. It showed personal loans and arrangements that made public investors uncomfortable. It showed that WeWork depended heavily on Neumann, while also revealing reasons to worry about that dependence. The document did not need to shout, it only needed to be read. The reaction was swift because the public market had a different appetite than the private market. Private investors had funded WeWork in closed rooms. They had heard the pitch directly. They had watched Neumann perform the future in person. They had seen growth charts before seeing the full public document. Public investors received the story in colder form. They saw the losses beside the language. They saw the leases beside the mission. They saw the governance beside the valuation. They saw a company asking to be trusted while revealing structures that made trust harder. It is one thing to hear a founder speak about community in a room filled with believers. It is another to read a risk factor explaining that the company's future depends heavily on that founder. It is one thing to see a WeWork space full of energy. It is another to see the long-term obligations behind thousands of desks. It is one thing to say the company is changing work. It is another to explain why it loses so much money while doing so. The public markets did not reject every growth company with losses. They rejected this combination: losses, leases, control, self-dealing concerns, vague mission language, a valuation that seemed to belong to a different kind of company. That combination was difficult to defend. The first warnings had been visible before the filing. Some analysts had long questioned whether WeWork was a real estate company dressed as technology. Some investors had questioned whether the valuation made sense. Some people inside the industry understood that flexible office space could be cyclical. Some employees had experienced the intensity of the culture and the speed of expansion. Journalists had reported on aspects of Neumann's style and the company's unusual practices. But before the S-1, the story still had enough fog around it. The numbers were private. The valuation was private. The strongest believers could still say the skeptics did not understand. The filing made that defense harder. Skepticism no longer looked like lack of imagination. It looked like reading. There is a particular danger when a company builds an identity around being misunderstood. Some great companies are misunderstood early. Their markets are new. Their economics look strange. Their products require new habits. Investors who dismiss them too quickly can miss something important. But being misunderstood is not proof of greatness. Sometimes a company is understood very well. Sometimes the problem is not that outsiders fail to see the vision. Sometimes the problem is that outsiders finally see the machinery. WeWork had enjoyed years of interpretive generosity. Strange language could be called visionary. Large losses could be called investment. Founder control could be called alignment. Rapid expansion could be called market capture. Side ventures could be called ecosystem building. The S1 changed the vocabulary. Visionary became vague, investment became burn, alignment became governance risk, market capture became lease exposure, ecosystem became distraction. The same facts remained. The frame changed. That is one of the quiet truths of financial collapse. Nothing has to change inside the company for everything outside it to change. A filing can do it. A downgrade can do it. A failed financing can do it. A single public document can turn a story from future tense into past tense. After the S1, WeWork tried to adjust. The company considered lowering the valuation for the IPO. It made changes to governance. It tried to reassure investors. The Neumann-related trademark payment became an embarrassment and was reversed. The company attempted to show that it had heard concerns, but the concerns were not cosmetic. They were structural. The public market was not merely asking for better wording. It was asking whether the company deserved the price. It was asking whether the founder could be trusted with public shareholders' money. It was asking whether the business could survive without constant capital. It was asking what would happen in a downturn. It was asking whether the lease machine had been built too fast. Those questions could not be solved by a new sentence in a filing. They required a different company. The unraveling moved quickly because WeWork needed the IPO. This is important. The offering was not only a trophy, it was connected to financing. The company had arranged access to a large credit facility that depended on completing the IPO. Without the offering, the company's cash position became more dangerous. The public listing was supposed to open a new source of capital. Instead, the path began to close. When a company is losing money quickly, time becomes expensive. Every month requires cash. Every lease continues. Every employee must be paid. Every build-out underway consumes resources. Every landlord watches the news. Every lender becomes more alert. Every member wonders whether the company will still be there. The collapse of confidence can become operational before a company actually runs out of money. This is because businesses are made from expectations. Landlords expect rent. Employees expect salaries. Members expect access. Suppliers expect payment. Lenders expect covenants to be respected. Investors expect a plausible path to value. When those expectations begin to shake, everyone protects themselves. The company is forced to reassure many audiences at once. Reassurance takes time. Time takes cash. Cash was the thing WeWork needed most. The board faced a hard problem. Adam Neumann was the company's central asset and its central liability. He had raised the money, he had created the mythology, he had attracted employees, investors, landlords, and attention. But after the S1, his control and conduct had become obstacles. Public investors were not only evaluating WeWork, they were evaluating Adam Neumann. The founder who had made the story larger than real estate now made the concerns larger than finance. His style had once seemed inseparable from the company's value. Now it seemed inseparable from its risk. This is a difficult transition for any founder-led company. The qualities that help a founder build can become the qualities that prevent a company from maturing. Certainty can become rigidity. Charisma can become dependence. Speed can become carelessness. Vision can become refusal to measure. Power can become governance risk. At WeWork, the transition arrived in public and under pressure. In September 2019, Adam Neumann stepped down as chief executive. The announcement did not solve the underlying business problem, but it acknowledged that the IPO could not proceed with the old arrangement intact. The founder moved out of the central role. The company began to look for rescue. Behind the public headlines, the problem was increasingly concrete. WeWork needed money. It had grown with the assumption that more capital would be available. When the IPO faltered, the assumption failed. There were discussions about financing. JP Morgan was involved in potential debt arrangements. SoftBank, already the largest backer, became the likely rescuer. The choices were not elegant. They were the choices of a company whose public dream had met private urgency. A rescue from SoftBank would keep WeWork alive. It would also confirm how far the company had fallen. The valuation was no longer $47 billion. Reports at the time placed rescue valuations far below that level, around $8 billion or less depending on the structure discussed. Numbers that had once seemed flexible now became brutal. $47 billion had been a story about possibility. $8 billion was a story about survival. The difference was not merely accounting, it changed the lives of employees. Many had accepted lower cash compensation because they believed equity would be valuable. Private company stock options are promises shaped by future events. They can become life-changing. They can also become almost nothing. Employees often live inside the company's optimism. They hear the all-hands meetings. They see the expansion. They know the investors. They know the valuation. They work late under the assumption that sacrifice is being stored somewhere. At WeWork, much of that stored sacrifice evaporated. The valuation fell too far. Options became underwater. People who had believed they were building a historic company found themselves holding paper tied to a damaged one. The human consequences did not arrive as one headline. They arrived as layoffs. They arrived as canceled projects. They arrived as conversations with spouses and roommates. They arrived as employees updating resumes after years of being told they were part of a mission. More than 12,000 people would lose their jobs in the broader restructuring period. The number is large enough to become abstract. It should not be. Each job belonged to a life. Each life had made decisions around the company's promise. Some had relocated. Some had joined because they believed in the mission. Some had joined because WeWork looked like the next great startup. Some had joined because the offices felt alive. Some had joined because stock options seemed like a path to security. When the company turned, those reasons did not protect them. The restructuring moved through the company like cold air through a building after the heat fails. The same offices remained. The same chairs sat under the same lights. But people understood the room differently. The kombucha taps no longer symbolized abundance. They symbolized a period that had ended. The private jet was sold. The wave pool investment became a kind of shorthand for excess. Non-core businesses were cut. The We company became WeWork again. The name shrank back toward the business. That shrinking was not only branding, it was reality returning. The company had to become narrower because the wider dream had become unaffordable. It had to negotiate with landlords. It had to reduce headcount. It had to close or exit locations. It had to stop behaving like an empire of possibility and start behaving like a company with obligations. That shift is often the hardest part of a collapse. Not the moment when the dream fails, the morning after, the ordinary work of survival, the calls, the spreadsheets, the leases, the severance packages, the lawyers, the rewritten budgets, the employees who remain and must keep operating a company whose mythology has been punctured. The world may move on to the next story. The company cannot. It has to keep paying bills. It has to keep cleaning offices. It has to keep answering member emails. It has to keep negotiating with landlords who have their own lenders and obligations. It has to keep functioning after the symbol has broken. This is why corporate collapse often has two timelines. There is the public timeline. It is fast. The filing, the headlines, the resignation, the bailout, the layoffs, the bankruptcy. Then there is the operational timeline. It is slower. It continues in conference calls and lease amendments. It continues in court filings. It continues in restructuring plans. It continues in buildings where people still need Wi-Fi, coffee, printers, access cards, and clean bathrooms. WeWork's public fall was dramatic. Its operational unwinding was administrative. Both are part of the same file. For a while, the rescue worked in the narrow sense. The company did not disappear in 2019. SoftBank took greater control. New leadership tried to stabilize the business. The mission language became quieter. The public performance changed. The company still had buildings. It still had members. It still had a recognizable brand. And then the world changed in a way no S1 had predicted. In 2020, the pandemic emptied offices around the world. The timing was cruel. WeWork had already been weakened by its failed IPO and rescue. Then the basic assumption behind office membership was shaken. People were told to stay home. Companies closed offices. Cities quieted. The daily rituals of work were interrupted. Commuting stopped for millions. Elevators went unused. Conference rooms sat empty. The very thing WeWork sold, shared physical workspace, became difficult to use. The pandemic did not create WeWork's original problem. The lease mismatch had existed before. The governance concerns had existed before. The losses had existed before. But the pandemic made the physical risk more visible. If members could leave or pause, the building still remained. If companies reconsidered office needs, lease obligations still remained. If remote work became more accepted, demand became harder to forecast. The company that had promised the future of work was now living through a future in which work had left many offices. That contradiction was not simple. In one sense, flexible office space could benefit from uncertainty. Companies unsure about long leases might prefer flexible arrangements. Workers tired of home might need occasional desks. Large employers might use co-working spaces as satellite offices. There was a version of the post-pandemic world in which WeWork's product became more useful. But usefulness is not the same as solvency. A product can be relevant while the balance sheet is damaged. A brand can be known while its obligations are too heavy. A company can serve a real need and still be unable to survive its own capital structure. WeWork eventually went public in 2021 through a SPAC transaction. The valuation was far below the $47 billion private peak. The listing gave the company a public form, but it did not restore the old dream. By then, the mythology had changed. WeWork was no longer the company that would elevate consciousness. It was a company trying to repair a business after a spectacular public failure. The market saw it differently. The old aura had been spent. The company continued working through leases, costs, and occupancy. It negotiated. It cut. It tried to find a sustainable shape, but the weight remained. In November 2023, WeWork filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. The filing did not mean every office closed immediately. Bankruptcy often sounds like an ending. Sometimes it is. Often, for a company with operations, it is a legal room where debts and contracts are rearranged. The company seeks protection while it restructures. It tries to reject or renegotiate leases. It tries to reduce obligations. It tries to become smaller, cleaner, and less burdened by old promises. For WeWork, bankruptcy was the formal recognition of a truth that had been moving through the company for years. The old structure could not hold. The leases were too heavy. The business needed a different shape. The final collapse was not a single moment of stupidity. It was an accumulation. A founder who made the story larger than the business. Investors who rewarded scale before discipline. A market that valued possibility at a premium. A company that confused brand heat with durable economics. A lease model that worked only if confidence, occupancy, and capital kept arriving. And a public filing that made the whole arrangement legible. Legibility can be fatal. Not because truth destroys good companies. Good companies can survive being understood. Weak stories cannot. WeWork's story was not entirely weak. That is what makes it linger. The loneliness was real. The desire for better workspaces was real. The old office model did feel tired to many people. The need for flexibility was real. The members were not hallucinations. The communities inside some locations were not invented. Some companies used WeWork because it genuinely solved a problem. Some workers built real friendships there. Some founders remember those spaces as the place where their companies began. The failure was not that WeWork offered nothing. The failure was that it priced its offering as if it had solved everything. There is a quiet difference between usefulness and destiny. WeWork was useful. It was not destiny. Adam Neumann's personal aftermath became part of the public discomfort. He left WeWork with a large package connected to the SoftBank rescue arrangements, though parts of later transactions and disputes changed over time. The broad perception remained simple. The founder left with extraordinary wealth. Many employees left with far less. That contrast became one of the moral centers of the story. It is not unusual for founders to become rich while employees do not. Startup equity is risky. Options are not guarantees. Private valuations can fall. But WeWork's culture had wrapped the risk in mission language. Employees had not merely joined a company. They had been invited into a cause. When a cause ends with layoffs and worthless options while the founder remains wealthy, the language curdles. Words that once inspired begin to accuse. Community, mission, family, consciousness. Those words are not empty by nature, but they become dangerous when used to soften the hard edges of financial risk. Employees can give too much of themselves to a company that speaks like a movement. Investors can forgive too much when a company speaks like a platform. Customers can believe too much when a brand speaks like a lifestyle. The WeWork file is not only about Adam Neumann. It is about a period when capital wanted large stories. It is about how a room can be staged to feel like an economy. It is about the temptation to treat atmosphere as evidence. It is about how a real need can become a dangerous valuation. It is about how a founder can become so central to the company that removing him becomes necessary and destabilizing at the same time. It is about how a business with physical obligations borrowed the emotional language of software. And it is about how quickly public markets can remove the benefit of the doubt. The aftermath spread beyond WeWork. Investors became more skeptical of companies with large losses and uncertain paths to profit. The phrase tech-enabled real estate began to receive more careful attention. Governance mattered more. Founder control received harder questions. Related party transactions became harder to explain away. The market did not stop funding ambitious companies. It never does. Memory in finance is real but imperfect. Each generation relearns some lessons under new names. But WeWork became a reference point, a shorthand. When a company claimed to be more than its underlying business, people asked if it was another WeWork. When a valuation seemed detached from ordinary economics, people asked if the number was carrying too much belief. When a founder's language grew too large, people listened for the lease hidden underneath. That may be WeWork's most durable legacy. It gave investors a new cautionary shape. Not fraud in the classic sense. Not a product that never existed, not a balance sheet that no one could understand, but a company whose real business was visible and still somehow mispriced by the people closest to it. The desks were there, the offices were there, the revenue was there, the members were there. The problem was that the story around those facts became too expensive. After the bankruptcy, WeWork continued in altered form. Companies can survive their myths. Sometimes they become smaller and more practical. Sometimes they become ordinary after trying to become historic. There is dignity in ordinary business when it is honest about what it is. A workspace company can be useful. A landlord can provide value. A flexible office provider can help customers manage uncertainty. There is no shame in being a real estate business. The shame comes from needing to be called something else to justify the price. In the end, WeWork had to return to the thing it had tried to transcend. Space, rent, members, leases, occupancy, cash. Those words are plain. They do not elevate consciousness, but they tell the truth. And in business, the truth is often less glamorous than the pitch deck. It is also more durable. The final image is not Adam Neumann on a stage. It is not Masayoshi Son in a brief meeting. It is not the S1 glowing on a screen in August 2019. It is a quiet office after hours. The lights have dimmed. The glass walls reflect empty chairs. The long communal table is clean. The phone booths are silent. The plants stand in their corners. The taps are closed. Outside, the city continues without needing to explain itself. Inside, the room still contains the promise that made WeWork appealing in the first place. People do need places to gather. People do need work to feel less lonely. People do need rooms where uncertain projects can begin. That part was true. It was always true. But truth does not remove the need for arithmetic. The building still stands. Someone may sit there tomorrow. They may open a laptop. They may take a call. They may start a company, write a proposal, send an invoice, or wait quietly for an idea to become clearer. They may never think about the valuation. They may never read the S1. They may only need a desk. That is enough. It was always enough. The tragedy of WeWork is that enough was not enough for the story. The story needed to be larger. The story needed to be global. The story needed to be spiritual. The story needed to be worth $47 billion. And once the story grew that large, the desks underneath it could no longer carry the weight. So the file closes on a simple room. No music, no pitch, no mission statement. Only a lease, a table, a chair, and the old lesson waiting in the quiet. A company can sell belonging, but it still has to pay rent. To understand why the story became so powerful, it helps to return to New York before the name became famous, before the global map, before SoftBank, before the $47 billion valuation, before the public filing that turned belief into evidence. There was a city still recovering from one financial era and entering another. New York has always known how to turn space into money. It does this through towers, leases, neighborhoods, brokers, zoning maps, and the quiet confidence of people who understand that location can become destiny. Office space in New York is not merely shelter, it is status, it is proximity. It is proof that a business has arrived, or at least that it wants to look as if it has. For decades, the office lease had been one of the rights of corporate adulthood. A company signed for years, it hired lawyers, it negotiated with landlords, it paid for build-outs, it bought furniture, it placed its name on a door. The commitment itself was part of the signal. If a company could sign the lease, it must be real. But after the financial crisis, reality had become less stable for many young businesses. The old signals did not fit the new rhythm. Startups could grow from 3 people to 30 quickly. They could also shrink just as quickly. Freelancers could earn serious money without belonging to one company. Remote workers could be employed by firms far away. Consultants could move from project to project. Designers, engineers, writers, founders, recruiters, and small agencies all needed workspaces that did not punish uncertainty. The coffee shop had become an informal office, but it was never enough. Coffee shops were noisy, tables were scarce, calls were awkward, clients could not always be invited. The apartment was quiet but isolating. The traditional office was professional but rigid. Between those options, WeWork found room. It did not invent co-working. That matters. The practice existed before WeWork. Small shared offices and business centers had served entrepreneurs for years. Ragis, later IWG, had built a global business around flexible offices long before WeWork became a cultural symbol. But older shared office companies often felt corporate. They solved practical problems without creating a movement around them. WeWork changed the emotional packaging. It made shared office space feel young. It made flexibility feel aspirational. It made renting a desk feel like joining a scene. This was not a trivial achievement. In consumer businesses, packaging can alter behavior. People do not buy only function. They buy meaning. They buy the version of themselves a product seems to confirm. WeWork understood that a small company did not only need a desk, it needed to feel less small. A freelancer did not only need Wi-Fi, she needed to feel less alone. A young founder did not only need a conference room, he needed a room that made the pitch feel plausible. The office became a mirror. If the room looked modern, perhaps the company inside it was modern. If the room was full of other people building things, perhaps the struggle was normal. If the brand on the door was known, perhaps the business behind a laptop had more weight. WeWork sold that mirror. Adam Neumann was especially skilled at describing the mirror as a window. He did not say the company made people feel like they belonged. He said it created community. He did not say WeWork rented smaller offices inside larger offices. He said it was changing the way people work. He did not say the design was attractive. He said the company was elevating consciousness. The distance between those descriptions is large, but in the early years the distance created lift. The bigger language made the ordinary business feel less ordinary. Investors often say they are looking for large markets. What they are also looking for is a story that makes a large market feel newly available. Office space is a very large market. It is also old, local, and difficult. To turn it into a venture-scale opportunity, WeWork had to make the old market look newly broken. Neumann could do that. He could speak about the loneliness of work. He could speak about millennials rejecting old office culture. He could speak about flexibility. He could speak about the global nature of talent. He could speak about the need for meaning. Each point contained some truth. Together they made office leasing sound like a social problem waiting for a founder. That framing attracted capital. It also attracted employees who wanted their work to matter. The early employees at companies like WeWork often live inside a strange combination of exhaustion and belief. The company is not yet stable. The job description changes. Systems are incomplete. New locations open quickly. Problems arrive before policies. People work late because there is always another opening, another member issue, another landlord negotiation, another investor visit, another event, another internal request. The culture can feel chaotic. It can also feel alive. For some people, that aliveness is addictive. They are close to the center. They see decisions being made quickly. They feel history might be forming around them. They accept the disorder because the company tells them the disorder is growth. The boundary between commitment and exploitation can become difficult to see, especially when equity is involved. Stock options have a special power in startup culture. They transform present sacrifice into future possibility. They allow a company to pay less today by promising a share of tomorrow. The promise is not always explicit. It often lives in the atmosphere. The valuation is mentioned. The investors are mentioned. The growth is mentioned. The IPO is imagined. People begin to calculate silently. If the company goes public at this value, what might my options be worth? If it becomes the next great company, what might my years of work become? That calculation is emotional as much as financial. It makes people patient with chaos. It makes long nights easier. It makes mission language feel material. At WeWork, the valuation made the calculation enormous. $47 billion is not a normal company number. It is a number that enters personal fantasy. It changes how employees think about apartments, debt, families, future freedom, and the meaning of their labor. This is one reason the collapse hurt so deeply. The loss was not only financial, it was imaginative. People had pictured a future. Then the S1 changed the picture. The investors had their own psychology. They were not simply fooled by a tall founder and attractive offices. That explanation is too easy. Many investors understood the risks and invested anyway because the broader market rewarded boldness. The decade after the financial crisis had created an unusual environment. Interest rates were low. Capital searched for returns. Private companies stayed private longer. Large venture funds competed to enter promising deals. The most successful technology companies had made early skeptics look foolish. Amazon had spent years emphasizing growth over profits. Uber and Airbnb had challenged traditional industries. Facebook, Google, and other platforms had shown how quickly scale could become power. The lesson many investors absorbed was not always precise. Sometimes it became simplified: grow fast, win the market, profits can come later. That lesson became dangerous when applied to businesses with different economics. A software platform can sometimes grow with relatively low incremental cost. A real estate platform cannot escape physical cost in the same way, but the language of growth moved faster than the analysis of cost. WeWork benefited from that gap. It presented itself as a platform for work. It suggested that offices were only the beginning. It implied that its relationship with members could expand into many parts of life. If WeWork knew where people worked, perhaps it could know how they lived, learned, exercised, met others, and consumed services. The We company name captured that ambition. It was vague, but vagueness can be useful when investors are buying possibility. Specific claims can be disproved. Expansive visions can keep moving. If the company is not yet profitable, it is because the vision is still unfolding. If one venture is not working, it is because the ecosystem is early. If skeptics ask for numbers, they can be told that the numbers belong to an old category. The category itself is being remade. This is how language can protect a company from measurement, not forever, but for a time. The board and investors around WeWork faced a familiar problem. The founder had created much of the value they hoped to realize. Constraining him could reduce the magic. Failing to constrain him could increase the risk. This tension appears often in founder-led companies. The founder is both engine and fire. Investors want heat. They do not want the building to burn. In private markets, governance can be negotiated among a smaller group. If the company is growing, investors may tolerate arrangements that would look strange in a public company. They may accept special voting rights. They may accept related party transactions. They may accept a founder's unusual style. They may believe that discipline can arrive later. Later is a dangerous place in business. Many decisions are sent there. Profitability can come later. Governance can improve later. Controls can tighten later. The culture can professionalize later. The founder can be managed later. The public market can understand later. But later eventually becomes today. For WeWork, today arrived in the S1. The governance disclosures were not incidental. They told public investors how power worked. Adam Neumann had control through share structure. The company's future was closely tied to him. There were transactions that made investors uneasy. He had purchased buildings and leased space to WeWork through entities he controlled, creating concerns about conflicts. The company had paid for rights related to the We trademark after the name change, a decision that drew strong criticism and was later unwound. These details mattered because they changed the interpretation of the larger story. If a founder speaks about community while personally benefiting from arrangements with the company, the word community begins to sound different. If a company asks public shareholders for trust while giving extraordinary control to one person, the request becomes harder. If a business is losing money quickly while the founder has borrowed against or sold shares, investors ask whose risk is being carried. The filing did not need to prove bad intent, it only needed to reveal misalignment. Public investors are sensitive to misalignment because they enter after the early private gains have already been marked. They do not want to provide liquidity for insiders at a price unsupported by economics. They do not want to buy into a structure where they have little control and large exposure. They do not want a founder's personal mythology to be the main defense of a valuation. In WeWork's case, the mythology had become too visible. People began reading the S1 not only as a financial document but as a psychological document. The mission statement drew attention. The corporate language drew mockery. A phrase about elevating consciousness became a symbol of overreach. But the mockery, while understandable, can obscure the deeper point. The problem was not that the company used strange language. Many companies use strange language. The problem was that the strange language sat beside ordinary obligations that were not being ordinary in size. If WeWork had been profitable, controlled, and modestly valued, the language might have been harmless. It might have seemed eccentric. It might even have seemed charming. But when losses are high and governance is weak, language becomes evidence. It suggests how leaders think. It suggests what they measure. It suggests what they may be willing to ignore. At WeWork, the language suggested that management wanted to be judged on transformation rather than economics. Public investors declined. The reaction also revealed a difference between customers and shareholders. Customers can love a product that shareholders should not buy at any price. A member might enjoy WeWork deeply. The office might improve their day. The coffee might be good. The community manager might be helpful. The location might help their small business survive. None of that proves the equity is worth $47 billion. This distinction is often lost in consumer-facing collapses. People assume that if a product is real and useful, the company must be sound. But companies fail around real products all the time. They fail because the cost of delivering the product exceeds what customers pay. They fail because growth was financed poorly. They fail because fixed obligations are too large. They fail because governance creates distrust. They fail because the price paid for the company assumes a future the business cannot reach. WeWork's members did not need the company to be worth $47 billion. They needed the doors to open. They needed the internet to work. They needed the conference room to be available. They needed their clients to find the building. They needed the monthly fee to make sense. The valuation belonged to another audience. That audience eventually walked away. When the IPO began to fail, the company entered a phase that many high-growth businesses fear. It had to reduce the story faster than it could reduce the costs. Costs are sticky. Leases are contracts. Headcount cannot be cut without consequences. Construction projects cannot always be stopped cleanly. Reputation cannot be repaired by memo. The story can fall in a week. The obligations remain for years. That mismatch is another form of maturity risk. Belief is short-term funding. Leases are long-term debt by another name. When belief leaves, the debt remains. The company's leadership had to move from expansion to triage. Triage is a different kind of management. Expansion asks where the next opportunity is. Triage asks what can be saved. Expansion celebrates openings. Triage studies exits. Expansion hires. Triage cuts. Expansion uses language like growth, community, and future. Triage uses language like liquidity, obligations, covenants, runway, restructuring, and severance. The vocabulary changes because reality changes. Employees feel that change before outsiders do. They feel it in meeting tone. They feel it in delayed decisions. They feel it in rumors. They feel it in calendar invitations. They feel it when executives who once spoke confidently begin choosing words more carefully. They feel it when all-hands meetings become harder to interpret. They feel it when recruiters stop calling as often and journalists start calling more. Inside a collapsing company, information arrives unevenly. Some people know too much. Some know almost nothing. Most know enough to worry. They keep working anyway. The printers still need paper. Members still need help. Buildings still need staff. Sales teams still need to sell. Finance teams still need to update forecasts. Human resources teams still need to prepare for decisions they may hate. The outside world watches a spectacle. The inside world lives a schedule. This is one of the reasons the WeWork collapse belongs in a sleep documentary rather than only a business scandal. Its drama was loud, but its consequences were ordinary. People lost jobs, people changed plans, people packed desks, people explained to families why a company once described as historic could not protect them. People who had believed in community discovered the limits of corporate belonging. The company was not a family, it was an employer. Employers can create meaningful places. They can create friendships. They can create pride. But when the numbers fail, the language of family does not pay severance. This is not cynicism. It is a boundary. Healthy companies respect that boundary. Unhealthy cultures blur it. WeWork blurred it beautifully. That was part of its power and part of its cost. SoftBank's role deserves its own quiet examination. Not because SoftBank alone created WeWork, it did not. The company existed before SoftBank's largest commitments. The demand existed. The offices existed. The culture existed. Neumann's charisma existed. But SoftBank gave the story a scale that ordinary funding could not have provided. It changed the weather around WeWork. When a company receives small amounts of capital, it must usually move with some restraint. It can still make mistakes, but mistakes meet limits. The company must choose markets. It must pace hiring. It must prove locations. It must negotiate with the fact that money is finite. Very large capital can remove those limits. This can be powerful when the business model is ready. It can be destructive when the business model still needs discipline. SoftBank's Vision Fund was built on the belief that the largest opportunities should be funded with unusual force. If a market was going to be won by scale, the fund wanted its companies to scale faster than anyone else. This logic had internal coherence. In some markets, being the largest player creates advantages. It helps with brand recognition. It helps with recruiting. It helps with supplier terms. It helps with customer acquisition. It can discourage competitors. It can allow a company to absorb losses while others retreat. But scale is not a universal medicine. If the core unit economics are poor, scale can multiply the problem. If each new location adds risk, opening more locations adds more risk. If leases are signed too aggressively, capital does not eliminate the obligations. It only makes it easier to sign them. This is one of the quiet dangers of abundant funding. Money can look like proof when it is only fuel. Fuel makes the machine move. It does not prove the machine is sound. Masayoshi Son had a reputation for bold bets. He could look at a founder and imagine a market far larger than the one currently visible. This capacity had made him extraordinary. It had also made him vulnerable to certain kinds of conviction. Adam Neumann was a founder built for conviction. He did not arrive with cautious language. He did not speak like a landlord optimizing square footage. He spoke like a person who believed that physical space could become a global network of human potential. For an investor trained to search for huge outcomes, that language had appeal. The meeting between Son and Neumann became part of WeWork lore because it seemed to compress the entire era into a few minutes. A founder with a vast story, an investor with vast capital, a market hungry for the next platform, a business that could be described simply enough to be understood and grandly enough to be mispriced. The result was acceleration. WeWork expanded, it signed more leases, it opened more locations, it hired more people, it moved into more countries, it began to imagine itself beyond offices. The company had always been ambitious. SoftBank helped make the ambition operational. This changed negotiations with landlords. A landlord facing WeWork did not see a small subleasing startup. The landlord saw a company backed by some of the deepest private capital in the world. That backing mattered. It could make landlords more willing to sign large deals. It could make WeWork appear more creditworthy. It could allow the company to negotiate from a position of confidence. But the same confidence that helped WeWork sign leases also increased its exposure. Every successful negotiation created another obligation. The balance sheet became a record of belief converted into contracts. Each contract had dates, payments, square footage, and penalties. The pitch could move on to the next city. The lease stayed behind. This is one reason real estate can discipline stories more harshly than software. Software promises can fail quietly. A product can be discontinued. A feature can be rewritten. Servers can be scaled down. Teams can be cut. But a building is heavy. A 10-year lease is heavy. A build-out is heavy. The walls do not care that the market narrative has changed. They remain, asking to be paid for. The Vision Fund era also created psychological pressure on competitors. When one company raises enormous capital, other companies must decide how to respond. Do they match the spending? Do they retreat? Do they find a niche? Do they seek their own large backers? In some sectors, SoftBank-backed companies changed the competitive environment by making ordinary discipline seem like weakness. If a competitor tried to grow profitably, it might lose market share to a better-funded rival willing to subsidize growth. This logic can distort a market. Customers enjoy subsidized prices. Landlords enjoy eager tenants. Employees enjoy expansion. Investors enjoy growth charts. But the subsidy has to end somewhere. Eventually, someone asks whether the company can stand without the capital that lifted it. For WeWork, the answer remained uncertain until the public markets forced the question. SoftBank was not the only believer. J.P. Morgan had a deep relationship with Neumann and the company. Benchmark and other venture investors had backed the rise. Real estate partners participated, employees participated, members participated, journalists participated in the sense that the story received attention proportional to its ambition. This does not mean everyone was equally responsible. It means the story required an ecosystem. Great private valuations do not form in isolation. They need capital, language, comparables, optimism, and a surrounding culture willing to suspend disbelief. WeWork's surrounding culture was ready. It was ready because the office itself had become symbolic. For many white-collar workers, the traditional office had come to represent stiffness, hierarchy, fluorescent light, commutes, cubicles, meetings that could have been emails, corporate identity that felt imposed rather than chosen. WeWork offered a softer image. It made work look social. It made independence look supported. It made entrepreneurship look designed. It made the lonely laptop economy feel communal. That image was especially persuasive in cities where people were already paying high rent to live in small spaces. If home was cramped and coffee shops were crowded, WeWork offered breathing room. If a startup could not afford its own polished office, WeWork offered borrowed polish. If a large company wanted flexible satellite space, WeWork offered speed. The product met multiple needs. This is why the collapse should not be read as proof that the idea was foolish. The idea was intelligent. The demand was real. The product was often useful. The brand was strong. The collapse came from the gap between useful and invincible. Investors paid for invincible. The company was useful. That gap widened every year. The valuation rose. The S1 did not create the gap. It measured it. The no-return sequence began before the official withdrawal of the IPO. It began when the public market audience started responding to the document with disbelief. First came the reading, then came the questions. Why were losses so high? Why was the company valued like technology? Why did governance give Neumann so much control? Why had the company paid him for the We trademark? Why were there related party lease arrangements? Why was the mission language so grand? Why should public shareholders accept a structure private investors had tolerated? Each question reduced the space for the old story. Companies can sometimes survive one concern. They can explain a loss. They can change a governance term. They can clarify a transaction. They can lower a valuation. But WeWork faced many concerns at once. The concerns reinforced each other. The losses made the governance more troubling. The governance made the mission language more troubling. The mission language made the valuation more troubling. The valuation made the lease obligations more troubling. The lease obligations made the need for cash more troubling. The need for cash made the failed IPO more dangerous. This is how collapses accelerate, not through one domino but through feedback. One doubt makes another doubt more credible. One disclosure changes how another disclosure is read. One headline makes lenders more cautious. One investor's hesitation makes another investor ask what they are missing. The company enters a narrowing corridor. At the beginning of the corridor, management still believes it can explain. At the end, explanation is no longer the issue. Survival is. For WeWork, valuation cuts were discussed. The number might come down from 47 billion, perhaps 20 billion, perhaps lower, but a lower valuation did not solve the deeper question. If the public market did not believe the business deserved a high technology multiple, the whole premise of the offering weakened. If the offering weakened too much, the company might not raise enough capital. If it did not raise enough capital, the credit facility tied to the IPO became uncertain. If the credit facility became uncertain, liquidity pressure grew. If liquidity pressure grew, WeWork needed a private rescue. If it needed a private rescue, SoftBank's leverage increased. The public offering had been designed as an entrance into a new stage. It became a doorway that would not open. Adam Neumann's position deteriorated as the doorway closed. His public image changed with remarkable speed. Before the filing, he was often described as visionary, eccentric, charismatic, intense, and unconventional. After the filing, those same traits were reinterpreted. Visionary became reckless, eccentric became irresponsible, charismatic became dangerous, intense became uncontrolled, unconventional became unfit for public markets. The person had not changed overnight. The interpretation had. This is one of the risks of founder mythology. It magnifies both directions. When the company rises, every unusual trait becomes part of the genius. When the company falls, every unusual trait becomes evidence of the flaw. The mythology that protects a founder can become a cage. Neumann could not easily become a quiet operator because the company had sold him as something larger. The board could not easily defend him because the market had begun reading him as the risk. When he stepped down as CEO, the decision seemed both dramatic and unavoidable. But removing the founder did not remove the leases. It did not remove the losses. It did not remove the need for rescue capital. It only removed the most visible obstacle to a different kind of negotiation. The company's fate moved into financing discussions. This is the phase where the glamour of startups disappears almost completely. There are no more inspiring stage talks. There are term sheets. There are emergency board meetings. There are lawyers. There are bankers. There are debt terms. There are competing rescue proposals. There are calculations of runway. There are lists of assets that can be sold. There are layoffs being modeled. There are landlords to call. There are employees to reassure without promising too much. There are journalists waiting outside every leak. The company that once said it wanted to elevate consciousness had to calculate how many weeks of cash remained. That contrast is not merely ironic, it is revealing. Every company, however grand its language, eventually reaches the same basic questions. What comes in? What goes out? Who is owed? Who will pay? How long can this continue? The moment of no return was not one headline. It was the recognition that WeWork could not reach the public markets on the terms its private valuation required and could not safely continue without new capital. Once that recognition settled, the old WeWork was over. The brand could survive, the offices could survive, some jobs could survive, but the story of WeWork as a $47 billion consciousness-elevating platform had ended. What remained was a company that needed rescue. SoftBank's rescue was therefore both salvation and verdict. It kept WeWork alive. It also marked the collapse of the previous valuation. Adam Neumann's exit package intensified public anger because it seemed to complete an old pattern. The founder who had presided over excess left with wealth. Employees faced layoffs, investors marked down holdings. The company cut costs. The public saw asymmetry. Asymmetry is one of the most powerful sources of outrage in business history. People can accept risk when they believe risk and reward are shared fairly. They become angry when downside appears to fall on workers while upside remains with leaders. WeWork became a symbol of that imbalance. It was not the first. It will not be the last. But it arrived at a moment when many people were already skeptical of startup wealth, founder worship, and private market excess. The story confirmed suspicions. It seemed to say that the age of giant visions had created a system where discipline came late and consequences landed unevenly. That is why WeWork lasted in public memory. Not only because the valuation fell, valuations fall often. Not only because the founder was unusual, unusual founders are common. Not only because the company went bankrupt, companies go bankrupt. WeWork lasted because all the symbols were visible. The kombucha, the glass walls, the barefoot founder, the mission language, the private jet, the wave pool, the SoftBank billions, the S1, the $47 billion number, the layoffs, the bankruptcy. It had the clarity of a parable. Business history rarely gives such clean symbols. Usually the machinery is hidden. Usually the documents are too complex. Usually the collapse is too technical. WeWork was technical underneath, but its surface was easy to remember. A company that rented desks said it would change the world. For a while the world believed it. Then the leases answered. The members experienced the collapse differently from investors. For many of them, WeWork was not a valuation. It was a place they went in the morning. It was a reception desk. It was an access card. It was a phone booth where they took calls. It was a kitchen where they met people they would not have met otherwise. It was a conference room booked for an important client. It was a mailing address. It was a line on an invoice. It was routine. Routine is powerful because it makes institutions feel stable. When a person enters the same building again and again, the building becomes part of the background of life. The elevator arrives, the door opens, the lights are on, the coffee is there, the Wi-Fi connects. The body begins to trust the place before the mind has examined the company behind it. For members, the public collapse could feel distant at first. The headlines were about valuation, SoftBank, Adam Neumann, and the IPO. But the members still needed to work. The laptop still opened. The meeting still began. The rent still came due. This separation between financial crisis and daily use is common in corporate failures. A company can be in trouble while the product still works. An airline can be bankrupt while flights still take off. A retailer can be restructuring while the store still opens. A co-working company can be collapsing financially while people still sit at the desks. That separation can make the crisis feel unreal. Until something changes, a location closes, a service disappears, a staff member is laid off, a repair takes longer, a landlord dispute becomes visible, a member wonders whether to renew. The abstract becomes physical. For landlords, WeWork was both opportunity and risk. A large WeWork lease could fill significant space. It could bring energy to a building. It could attract other tenants who liked the modern image. It could solve vacancy, but it also concentrated risk. If WeWork struggled, the landlord could be left with a large customized space and a difficult tenant. Commercial buildings often depend on predictable rent streams. Those rent streams support financing. They support valuations. They support the owner's own obligations. When WeWork signed a lease, it inserted itself into that chain. The chain did not end with WeWork. Behind the landlord might be lenders, investors, pension funds, insurance companies, or real estate investment trusts. Behind those institutions might be retirees, savers, and other people far removed from the glass walls and cold brew. Real estate is never only a building. It is a financial ecosystem attached to a physical address. WeWork's expansion touched that ecosystem city by city. During the rise, this made the company seem important. During the fall, it made the unwinding complicated. You cannot close a global office network as easily as deleting an app. Each lease has its own terms. Each landlord has its own position. Each city has its own market. Each building has its own financing. Each location has its own members. The bankruptcy process eventually became a way to sort through those obligations. Bankruptcy is often treated in public language as failure. Legally, it is also a tool. Chapter 11 allows a company to continue operating while it reorganizes. It can seek permission to reject certain leases. It can negotiate with creditors. It can propose a plan. It can reduce debt. It can try to emerge in a smaller form. For WeWork, this was not a philosophical process, it was practical. Which locations should remain open? Which leases were too expensive? Which landlords would negotiate? Which markets still made sense? How much debt could be converted, reduced, or reorganized? How could the company become viable after years of expansion under a different story? The bankruptcy court did not need to evaluate consciousness, it needed to evaluate claims. That is the final humbling of a company that has lived on expansive language. The language narrows to schedules. Assets, liabilities, creditors, executory contracts, debtor in possession financing, lease rejection, plan confirmation. The words are dry. They are also honest. They describe a world where promises have priority, amounts, and legal standing. WeWork's bankruptcy was therefore a return to grammar. The sentence had become too ornate. The court reduced it to nouns and numbers. The public reaction to WeWork's fall mixed fascination with irritation. People watched documentaries, they read articles, they followed Neumann's next moves. They debated whether the company was a scam, a dream, a real estate mistake, or a symptom of venture capital excess. The word scam was often used casually, but it does not fully capture the story. WeWork did not pretend there were no offices. It did not sell a machine that never existed. It did not invent the need for flexible space. It did not hide the fact that it leased buildings, though the implications were underappreciated. The better word is inflation, not inflation of currency, inflation of meaning. An office became a platform, a member became a community, a lease became a network, a founder became a prophet of work. A flexible desk company became a $47 billion transformation story. The facts were inflated until they could not fit inside the valuation. When the inflation ended, the facts remained. They looked smaller, they also looked more useful. This is why the story has a strangely gentle afterimage. Many people still understand why WeWork appealed. They may laugh at the excess, they may criticize Neumann, they may question SoftBank, they may see the governance problems clearly, but they can also remember the attraction of a well-designed room. They can understand why a lonely worker might want to sit near others. They can understand why a small startup might want a polished address. They can understand why a city full of uncertainty might produce demand for flexible belonging. The collapse did not invalidate the human need. It invalidated the valuation built around it. Adam Neumann's later venture, Flow, revived many questions. Flow was described as a real estate company focused on residential life. It raised major backing from Andreessen Horowitz. The investment drew attention because Neumann's WeWork exit was still fresh in public memory. Some saw it as evidence that capital forgives charismatic founders quickly. Others argued that founders who fail can still build again. Both ideas can be true in part. Failure does not permanently disqualify a person from entrepreneurship. Many founders learn from failure. But WeWork was not a small private failure. It had consequences for thousands of employees, investors, landlords, and cities. When a founder leaves such a collapse with wealth and returns with new funding, the public naturally asks what business culture rewards. Does it reward learning? Does it reward charisma? Does it reward access? Does it reward the ability to tell a large story even after the last large story broke? Those questions are not easily answered. They sit beside the WeWork file like loose papers. The business world often claims to reward results. It also rewards narrative. It rewards networks. It rewards confidence. It rewards the ability to make powerful people imagine a future in which they were early. Neumann had that ability. The fact that he had it once made investors listen. The fact that he had misused or overextended it before did not make them stop listening. This tells us something about the persistence of appetite. Markets may learn lessons, but appetite returns. It returns under new conditions. It returns with new language. It returns when capital is available. It returns when a founder walks into a room and makes an old idea feel newly inevitable. That is why WeWork remains useful as a file. Not because it prevents repetition, no file can do that, but because it gives the next observer a shape to recognize. When a company says it is not what it plainly appears to be, listen carefully. Sometimes it is true. Sometimes a company really is inventing a new category. Sometimes the old words fail, but sometimes the company is avoiding the old words because the old words would reveal the economics. If a company leases offices, ask about leases. If it rents desks, ask about occupancy. If it promises community, ask about churn. If it says it is a platform, ask what becomes cheaper as it grows. If it says losses are investments, ask when the investment ends. If it says the founder is essential, ask what happens when the founder becomes the risk. Those questions are not cynical. They are forms of respect. They respect the business enough to measure it. They respect employees enough not to hide risk behind mission. They respect customers enough not to confuse affection with solvency. They respect investors enough to distinguish story from structure. The WeWork story also belongs to the history of offices themselves. The office is not only a place of employment, it is a social invention. It organizes time. It creates hierarchies. It shapes habits. It separates home from work. It brings strangers into shared routines. For much of the 20th century, the office was a symbol of modern stability. People commuted to towers. They rode elevators. They sat at assigned desks. They answered phones. They joined departments. They built careers through organizations that seemed larger and more permanent than themselves. By the time WeWork rose, that older office world had been weakened. Technology made work more portable. Corporate loyalty declined. Freelance and contract work expanded. Young workers often expected more flexibility. Startups prized speed and informality. The office still mattered, but its meaning was changing. WeWork stepped into that change with unusual timing. It understood that the office had become emotionally available for reinvention. People were ready to believe that work could feel different. They were ready to believe that community might replace corporate hierarchy. They were ready to believe that a designed environment could make economic uncertainty feel creative rather than precarious. That belief was not foolish, it was human. The danger was that WeWork monetized the belief at a valuation that required near-mythic execution. The company had to be more than good. It had to be enormous. It had to justify the capital. It had to grow into the story before the story collapsed under its own cost. Many startups live under that pressure. Once a valuation becomes large enough, it stops being a reward and becomes a demand. The company must grow into it. Every future financing, employee promise, acquisition plan, and public market expectation bends around the number. The valuation becomes a ceiling that must be reached from below. If the business cannot reach it, the ceiling becomes weight. WeWork carried that weight visibly. $47 billion was not only an estimate, it was a burden. It required the world to see WeWork as something much larger than flexible office space. The S1 made that difficult. The public markets looked at the number, then looked at the business, then looked back at the number. The distance was too great. That distance is the heart of the file, between office and platform, between community and contract, between founder and governance, between growth and profit, between private belief and public disclosure, between what the company felt like and what the company owed. In that distance, the collapse formed. The final months before Neumann's exit have been described in many accounts with details of internal pressure, investor concern, and boardroom urgency. What matters for the larger story is the sequence of narrowing choices. First, the company hoped to go public at a valuation close enough to the private peak to preserve the mythology. Then it considered a lower valuation. Then public demand looked insufficient. Then governance changes became necessary. Then the founder's role became untenable. Then the offering was delayed. Then the company needed emergency financing. Then rescue terms replaced IPO dreams. Each step removed an assumption. The assumption of public appetite, the assumption of valuation support, the assumption of founder control, the assumption of capital access, the assumption of independence. By the end, WeWork was not choosing among futures. It was choosing among rescues. That is the moment a company knows the story has ended, not when criticism begins, not when the first bad article appears, not even when the stock price falls, if the company is already public. The story ends when the company can no longer choose its own terms. WeWork had spent years setting terms for others. It set terms for employees through culture. It set terms for landlords through expansion. It set terms for investors through access. It set terms for members through brand. After the S1, the terms were set by liquidity. Liquidity is a quiet master. It does not care about charisma. It does not care about mission. It does not care about design. It asks only whether money is available when obligations come due. If the answer is no, the conversation changes. The quietest part of the WeWork story may be the spaces themselves after the headlines faded. Most people do not experience corporate restructuring as drama. They experience it as small changes. A familiar employee is gone, a location feels less full, an event is canceled, snacks change, maintenance slows, the sales language shifts. The app still works, but the atmosphere is thinner. People are good at sensing institutional fragility. They may not know the balance sheet. They may not read bankruptcy filings. But they notice when confidence leaves a room. Confidence has a texture, so does uncertainty. In a WeWork location, uncertainty could be especially strange because the product was atmosphere. If the atmosphere weakened, the product weakened. The company was not only selling square footage, it was selling the feeling that the space was alive. Layoffs and restructuring threatened that feeling. This made the collapse operationally delicate. Cut too little and the company bleeds cash. Cut too much and the product loses the energy that justified the price. That tension is common in hospitality-like businesses. The cost is part of the experience. Remove the cost and you may remove the reason customers came. Keep the cost and you may never reach profit. WeWork's challenge after 2019 was to find a version of itself that preserved enough experience while removing enough excess. That is not easy. It is easier to build a myth than to resize one. Myths do not like moderation. They want scale, simplicity, and emotion. Restructuring wants detail. It wants negotiation. It wants compromise. It wants spreadsheets. It wants exact square footage and exact rent reductions. It wants the opposite of myth. This is why the years after Neumann were less cinematic but more revealing. They showed what remained when the founder's aura was gone. What remained was a company with a known brand, a real customer base, and a difficult balance sheet. That is a business problem, not a spiritual one. The office after WeWork's collapse did not become simple. The pandemic and remote work changed the market in ways that are still being sorted. Some companies reduced office footprints. Some adopted hybrid work, some workers missed offices, some never wanted to return full-time. Some downtowns struggled with lower foot traffic. Some flexible space providers found new opportunities. The future of work remained unsettled. WeWork had been early to a real conversation, but being early to a conversation is not the same as owning the answer. Sometimes a company identifies a change correctly and still builds the wrong structure around it. That may be the fairest way to see WeWork. It sensed something true about work. It sensed loneliness. It sensed flexibility. It sensed dissatisfaction with old offices. It sensed the appeal of design community. Then it built too much, promised too much, borrowed too much from the language of technology, and accepted too much capital at a valuation that required a world more obedient than the real one. The real world answered slowly. Then all at once. The S1 was the voice of the real world. The bankruptcy was the echo. Adam Neumann's psychology is difficult to separate from the company's architecture. This does not mean the company was only him. WeWork had thousands of employees. It had co-founders, executives, designers, community managers, salespeople, finance teams, lawyers, and operations staff. It had members who shaped the spaces by using them. It had investors and landlords who enabled the expansion. No company of that size belongs to one person alone. But WeWork's story was unusually founder-shaped. Neumann did not merely lead the company. He supplied its emotional frequency. His biography fit the pitch. A childhood marked by movement, a connection to communal life, a restless adult energy, a gift for presence, a belief that work could become belonging. These were not random details. They became part of the company's internal logic. Founders often build companies around unresolved questions in their own lives. Sometimes the question is practical. Why is this product so hard to use? Why is this service so expensive? Why does this market waste so much time? Sometimes the question is emotional. Where do I belong? How do I prove myself? How do I make uncertainty feel chosen? How do I turn movement into home? WeWork's emotional question seemed close to belonging. The company offered a world where mobility did not have to mean loneliness. One could move from city to city and still enter a familiar room. One could work for oneself and still feel surrounded. One could build a company without inheriting the old corporate shell. This was powerful because it spoke to a generation whose careers were becoming less stable. The traditional bargain between employer and employee had weakened. Work asked for flexibility. Workers wanted meaning in return. WeWork promised to make flexibility feel meaningful. Neumann's charisma helped because charisma can make abstraction feel intimate. When he spoke about community, people did not only hear a market concept, they felt addressed. They felt that he understood something about modern life. Whether he understood it fully is a different question. But he could name it in a way that made people lean forward. The danger of such charisma is that it can become a substitute for feedback. If a founder can persuade almost anyone in the room becomes a poor testing device. The founder leaves with confirmation. The listeners leave with excitement. The hard questions wait outside. This is why disciplined governance matters most around the most persuasive people. Quiet founders need governance. Charismatic founders need it more, not because charisma is bad. Charisma can recruit talent, raise capital, inspire teams, and open doors. But charisma can also bend the environment around the founder. People may soften criticism. They may wait for someone else to object. They may confuse their emotional reaction with analysis. They may want the founder's approval. They may fear being seen as small-minded. At WeWork, the surrounding culture often rewarded bigness, big claims, big openings, big valuations, big ideas about the future of work. In such an environment, the person asking small questions can seem out of place. What is the payback period on this build-out? What happens if occupancy falls by 10%? What happens if capital markets close? What happens if the founder cannot lead a public company? What happens if the brand does not translate to education, housing, or wellness? What happens if community is not a defensible moat? These are not glamorous questions, they are necessary questions. The warning was there, the appetite to hear it was not always there. Boardrooms are often imagined as places of cold rationality. In reality, they are rooms full of incentives, relationships, reputations, and incomplete information. Directors may believe in the founder. They may have approved earlier funding rounds. They may not want to admit that private valuations have run ahead of reality. They may fear damaging the company by challenging its public story too early. They may believe problems can be fixed after the next financing. They may have different time horizons. They may disagree privately but align publicly. They may be influenced by the same momentum as everyone else. This does not excuse weak oversight. It explains how weak oversight can persist around intelligent people. Intelligence does not remove incentive. Experience does not remove hope. Prestige does not remove the desire to believe one's earlier decisions were correct. WeWork's investors and directors had reasons to want the company to keep rising. A rising valuation validated past choices. It made portfolios look stronger. It helped attract attention to funds. It made future fundraising easier. It gave employees and later investors a number to organize around. When the number was $47 billion, it carried institutional pride. To question it was not only to question WeWork, it was to question the judgment of everyone who had helped create it. This is how numbers become defended. Not because they are true, because too many people have arranged themselves around them. The culture inside WeWork reflected the same arrangement. The company held events. It celebrated openings. It cultivated a sense of belonging that extended beyond desks. Summer Camp, the company's employee gathering, became famous as an expression of WeWork's internal world. There were speeches, music, activities, and the feeling of a corporate retreat transformed into a festival. To supporters, it represented culture. To critics, it represented excess. Both interpretations contain something real. Culture can be meaningful. Employees do bond through shared rituals. A fast-growing company needs stories to hold people together. But rituals can also become insulation. They can make participants feel they are part of something so special that ordinary measures do not apply. They can turn questioning into disloyalty. They can make the company feel more permanent than it is. The more immersive the culture, the harder it can be to step outside it. This is especially true in companies where the workplace is also the product. WeWork employees worked inside the atmosphere they were selling. They did not leave the brand at the office. The office was the brand. The culture surrounded them physically. Glass walls, communal tables, events, member stories, founder speeches, investor visits, and constant expansion all reinforced the same message. This is working. This is growing. This matters. When the collapse began, that immersive world made the reversal more disorienting. The same spaces now contained doubt. The same language now sounded strained. The same valuation now looked unreal. The same founder now appeared in headlines as a liability. In business history, there is often a moment when a company's internal story and external story separate. Inside, people are still trying to believe. Outside, observers have already moved on to skepticism. That gap can be painful. Employees read articles about their company and feel both defensive and afraid. They know the company is more than the article. They also know the article is not entirely wrong. They know the members they serve are real. They also know the company is under pressure. They know their colleagues are working hard. They also know layoffs may be coming. This double awareness is exhausting. It is one of the human costs of a public unraveling. The company's story is debated by strangers while employees are still inside it. The SPAC listing in 2021 gave WeWork a second public market chapter, but not a restoration of innocence. Special purpose acquisition companies had become popular during a period of market enthusiasm. They offered an alternative route to public markets. For WeWork, the SPAC path allowed the company to list after the failed traditional IPO, but the context was very different. The company was no longer selling the original dream. It was selling a restructured version of itself. The valuation was much lower. The leadership had changed. The world of offices had been altered by the pandemic. The market had already judged the old WeWork. The new listing could not erase the S1, it could only proceed after it. This distinction matters because public listing is sometimes treated as validation. But going public is not the same as proving a business model. It is a financing and ownership event. The market continues judging afterward. For WeWork, the judgment remained harsh. The shares struggled. The business still faced lease burdens. The pandemic's effects lingered. Remote and hybrid work complicated demand. Debt and lease obligations remained central. The company kept trying to adjust, but adjustment had to occur under the shadow of the old expansion. Old decisions can become long-lived. A lease signed in the optimism of one era may still require payment in the caution of another. This is why growth decisions should be understood as future governance. When leaders sign long obligations, they govern the options of future managers. They decide how much room the next leadership team will have. They decide how much cash must be found. They decide how hard the company must run just to remain in place. WeWork's later leaders inherited not only a company, they inherited a map of commitments drawn during a more euphoric period. Their task was not to dream. It was to undo, renegotiate, and survive. There is skill in that work. It is not as celebrated as founding. It does not produce magazine covers as easily, but it may be more difficult in some ways. To build during a boom, one can borrow energy from the market. To repair after a collapse, one must work against memory. Every negotiation carries the old story. Every landlord knows the company needs relief. Every investor remembers the failed IPO. Every employee has heard the jokes. Every customer has seen the headlines. The repair team does not get a blank page. It gets a damaged file. The 2023 bankruptcy filing was the culmination of that inheritance. It came after years of attempts to stabilize. It came after leadership changes. It came after a public listing. It came after pandemic disruption. It came after negotiations with landlords. It came after the myth had already collapsed. This is why the bankruptcy felt both dramatic and unsurprising. The public had seen the direction years earlier. But formal collapse still matters. It creates a legal boundary. Before bankruptcy, a company is struggling. After filing, the struggle enters court. The court becomes the room where private arrangements are sorted in public procedure. Claims are filed, schedules are reviewed, leases are examined, creditors organize, plans are negotiated. The company's past decisions become legal materials. That transformation is quiet but profound. Business ambition becomes paperwork. The same thing happened in other corporate collapses. Enron's trading mythology became bankruptcy schedules. Theranos's medical promises became trial exhibits and regulatory findings. WeWork's community language became lease rejection motions and restructuring plans. Each collapse translates a dream into a different format. The translation is never flattering. The dream uses verbs, the court uses nouns. The dream says transform. The court says obligation. The dream says community. The court says creditor. The dream says platform. The court says lease. In that translation, the final truth becomes visible, not the whole truth. No legal document can contain the whole human story, but the financial truth. What is owed, what can be paid, what must be changed, what cannot continue. The WeWork bankruptcy did not erase the cultural question the company had raised. How should people work? Where should they gather? What should offices feel like? How much flexibility do companies need? How much community do workers want? Those questions remain open. They are being answered slowly by millions of decisions. A company renews a lease. Another reduces its footprint. A worker goes to the office 2 days a week. Another rents a desk near home. A downtown tower loses tenants. A smaller flexible office fills. A startup decides not to sign a long lease. A landlord converts space. The future of work is not one answer. It is a scattered adjustment. WeWork tried to give it a single brand. Reality gave it many forms. That may be another lesson. Some social changes are too broad for one company to own. A company can ride them. It can shape them. It can profit from parts of them, but it cannot always contain them. Work changed. WeWork was part of that change. It was not the change itself. The difference between part and whole is easy to forget during a boom. Founders often speak as if their company and the future are the same object. Investors sometimes accept the claim because owning a piece of the future is more exciting than owning a piece of a company. But the future does not issue shares. Only companies do, and companies have costs. The public reaction to Adam Neumann's continued funding also revealed a deeper discomfort with second chances. Business culture admires resilience. It tells stories of founders who failed before succeeding. It encourages risk. It says that failure is part of innovation. Those ideas have value. A culture that punishes all failure too harshly becomes timid. But not all failures are the same. There is a difference between a small product that fails honestly and a giant company whose collapse harms thousands. There is a difference between personal learning and social cost. When a founder receives another large check after a costly failure, people ask whether the learning is being shared or the cost is being outsourced. Neumann's case sits inside that tension. Some investors may believe he learned from WeWork. Some may believe his talent remains rare. Some may believe the housing market offers a large opportunity. The public sees something else too. It sees continuity. It sees the same language of community returning. It sees a man who left a damaged company with wealth, receiving another chance that many employees would never receive. That perception may be incomplete, but it is not irrational. It reflects a moral accounting that formal finance often ignores. The financial ledger says who owns what. The moral ledger asks who paid for the lesson. In WeWork, many people paid. Employees paid with lost jobs and broken expectations. Investors paid with markdown stakes. Landlords paid through renegotiations and vacancies. Cities paid in smaller ways through empty offices and disrupted plans. SoftBank paid through reputational damage and investment losses. Adam Neumann paid in reputation and control, but remained wealthy. The distribution of pain was uneven. That unevenness is part of why the story still unsettles. Collapse file stories often return to one pattern. The story becomes more valuable than the truth. At WeWork, the truth was never entirely hidden. The company rented space. The leases existed, the losses existed, the founder's personality was visible. The ambition was public. What changed was the value placed on the story around those facts. The story made the leases seem like infrastructure. The story made the losses seem like investment. The story made the founders seem indispensable. The story made the offices seem like a network. The story made the community seem like a moat. When the story lost value, the truth looked different. It had been there all along. This is why WeWork is not simply a lesson in deception. It is a lesson in interpretation. People can look at true facts and draw inflated conclusions. They can see real growth and infer inevitable dominance. They can see real customer love and infer durable profit. They can see real charisma and infer leadership maturity. They can see real funding and infer validation. They can see real offices and infer a platform. No single inference has to be absurd. Together they can become dangerous. That is how belief compounds. Like interest, it grows on itself. An investor believes because another investor believes. An employee believes because investors believe. A landlord believes because employees and investors believe. A journalist writes because the valuation suggests importance. The article strengthens the brand strengthens recruiting. Recruiting strengthens growth. Growth strengthens valuation. Valuation strengthens belief. Then the S1 arrives, the compounding reverses. A journalist questions the losses. An investor questions the valuation. A lender questions the runway. An employee questions the options. A landlord questions the tenant. A board questions the founder. The same network that carried belief begins carrying doubt. Doubt compounds too. This compounding of doubt is the true sound of collapse. It is not loud at first. It begins in questions, then in meetings, then in revised numbers, then in postponed plans, then in resignations, then in layoffs, then in bankruptcy. By the time the public sees the final filing, the sound has been traveling for years. The final lull should not pretend the story is simple. WeWork was foolish and insightful, useful and overvalued, real and inflated, human and financial. It contained genuine community and performative community. It solved problems and created others. It gave some people meaningful workspaces and gave many employees painful lessons. It was not the future of work, but it did notice that the future of work would not look exactly like the past. That is why the file cannot be closed with only mockery. Mockery is too easy. The harder work is understanding why the promise appealed. The promise appealed because work is lonely, because cities are expensive, because starting something is frightening, because a room can change how a person feels about a risk, because people want evidence that they are not building alone, because beauty matters, because light matters, because the arrangement of chairs can make a conversation more likely, because a young company sometimes needs a borrowed sense of permanence, because belonging is valuable. Those truths remain after the bankruptcy. They sit quietly inside the wreckage. They are why a reduced version of the idea can survive. They are why other flexible office companies can exist. They are why people still search for better ways to gather. The failure belongs not to the need, but to the excess placed upon it. The need was human, the valuation was financial, the distance between them became too wide. Now imagine the office again late at night, not during the rise, not during the opening party, not during the investor tour, not when the founder is walking through with a crowd behind him. Imagine it after everyone has gone. The glass doors are locked. The city outside has softened into reflected light. The long table is empty. The chairs are pushed in. The phone booths are dark. The plants do not know the company has filed for bankruptcy. The walls do not know the valuation. The floor does not know the difference between a platform and a lease. The room is only a room. It was always only a room. And a room can be enough for a call, for a meeting, for a beginning, for a person who needs somewhere to sit while trying to make an uncertain life more stable. The tragedy was asking the room to become a revolution. The tragedy was making the lease carry a myth. The tragedy was turning belonging into a number so large that belonging itself disappeared behind it. In the morning, someone may unlock the door. The lights may come on. Coffee may be made. A member may arrive early. They may not care about Adam Neumann. They may not care about SoftBank. They may not know the name of the bankruptcy judge. They may only need the Wi-Fi password and a quiet place to work. The modesty of that need is almost peaceful. It brings the story back to scale. One person, one desk, one day of work. No $47 billion dream. No claim to elevate consciousness. No promise to remake civilization. Only work. Only space. Only the small hope that the place will be there tomorrow. That is where the file rests. Not in the pitch deck, not in the festival, not in the valuation, not in the headlines. It rests in the quiet distance between what people needed and what the company promised. The distance was filled for a while with music, capital, glass walls, investor confidence, and the voice of a founder who could make a lease sound like a movement. Then the music stopped. The capital tightened. The glass walls reflected empty chairs. The investors read the filing. The founder stepped aside. The company entered the long work of becoming smaller than its story. And somewhere in the archive, the WeWork file remains. A file about work, a file about loneliness, a file about rooms, a file about capital, a file about the danger of believing that atmosphere can replace arithmetic. The office is quiet now. The kombucha is gone. The desks wait without expectation. The building still stands. Only the belief has been revised. There is one more part of the file that deserves to be placed back on the table. It is the quieter founder story. Adam Neumann became the face of WeWork because he was built for the role. But Miguel McKelvey mattered. He brought a different sensibility to the company. McKelvey had grown up in a five-mother collective in Oregon, in an environment that also made community feel practical rather than decorative. He studied architecture. He understood that space is never neutral. A room can invite people in or keep them apart. A hallway can create movement or friction. A kitchen can become a social center or an afterthought. A conference room can feel sterile or alive. McKelvey's background helped WeWork become physically persuasive. This matters because the company's spaces were not incidental to the pitch. They were the pitch made visible. An investor could walk through a location and feel the argument before seeing a spreadsheet. A potential member could tour the space and imagine a better version of work. A journalist could photograph the furniture, the glass, the plants, and the people, then write about a company that seemed to embody a generational shift. Design became evidence. This is one of the most interesting parts of WeWork. The company did not only sell what the space was, it sold what the space suggested. Traditional offices often suggested hierarchy, corner offices, reception barriers, private floors, long corridors, closed doors. WeWork suggested movement and openness, glass instead of walls, shared tables instead of fixed cubicles, common kitchens instead of hidden break rooms, events instead of departmental isolation. The design told members they were part of an economy still being made. That feeling helped WeWork charge a premium. It also helped outsiders mistake experience for defensibility. A good experience can attract customers. It does not always prevent imitation. Competitors can copy furniture. Landlords can build lounges. Companies can redesign offices. Other co-working providers can improve aesthetics. The deeper moat had to come from something more durable. Brand, scale, relationships, data, enterprise contracts, or operational excellence. WeWork had some of these, but it did not have enough to justify the most extreme version of the story. The enterprise business became one attempt to strengthen the model. Large companies began using WeWork for teams, projects, satellite offices, and flexible needs. This was important because enterprise customers could be more stable than individual freelancers. They could rent larger blocks. They could provide recurring revenue. They could make WeWork look less dependent on fragile startup demand. In theory, enterprise demand supported the argument that flexible offices were becoming mainstream, and in some ways that argument was correct. Large companies did want more flexibility. They did not always want to sign leases for every new team. They wanted options in cities where they were testing markets. They wanted space for projects that might grow or end. WeWork could serve that need, but enterprise business also pulled the company closer to ordinary real estate services. The more WeWork served large companies, the less it looked like a spontaneous community of entrepreneurs. It looked more like a flexible office provider with a strong brand. That could still be valuable, but it was less mystical. The company faced a tension between the romance of community and the stability of enterprise revenue. Freelancers and startups gave the spaces cultural energy. Enterprise clients gave the business larger checks. Both mattered. But neither removed the lease risk. The design also had costs. Beautiful spaces require money. Common areas do not directly produce rent the way private offices do. Events require staff. Hospitality requires training. A space designed to feel generous may use square footage less densely than a purely efficient office. These choices can be smart if customers pay enough for the experience. They become dangerous if the company grows before proving that the premium covers the costs. WeWork's early locations often felt alive because they were designed with care. Care is expensive. The company needed the market to reward that care at enormous scale. Some locations may have done well, others did not. The public story tended to treat the portfolio as one global movement. The business reality was location by location. This is another important distinction. A brand can be global, profitability can be local. One city might have strong demand and favorable lease terms. Another might be expensive and slower to fill. One building might benefit from location and timing. Another might struggle because the neighborhood, layout, rent, or competition was wrong. The global story smoothed these differences. The financial statements eventually reintroduced them. The company had to manage construction, sales, community, maintenance, technology, billing, legal compliance, and local market conditions across many countries. That is difficult work. It is not impossible, but it is not weightless. When WeWork spoke like a technology company, it sometimes made the operational burden sound simpler than it was. Behind each beautiful location was a complex service operation. The community managers were central to that operation. They were often the human face of the company. They greeted members, they handled problems, they coordinated events, they answered questions. They made the space feel less anonymous. Their work turned design into experience. Without them, the product would have been colder. Yet in the public story, the focus often rested on the founder, the investors, and the valuation. The ordinary labor of maintaining community received less attention. This is common in companies built around atmosphere. The atmosphere seems effortless when it is working. It is not effortless. It is produced by people. People clean rooms. People restock supplies. People reset chairs. People handle complaints. People calm angry members. People fix access issues. People prepare for tours. People smile when the company is under stress. During a collapse, those frontline workers carry a special burden. They must represent stability while experiencing uncertainty. They may be asked questions they cannot answer. Is this location closing? Is my membership safe? Will the company survive? They may not know, but they still stand at the desk. The story of WeWork should include them, because they are the ones who made the promise tangible, not the valuation, not the S1, the daily work.